That necklace belongs to my grandmother. Emily's voice cracked barely a whisper, but every word landed like a blow, because right there in that courthouse hallway, Samantha Pierce stood laughing with Richard's attorney fingers casually stroking 11 sapphires arranged in a perfect fan shape around her throat. Stolen. Ripped from Emily's bedroom while she was 4 states away grieving her marriage. Carried out of her home like it meant nothing. And now worn into the very courtroom where Samantha planned to watch Emily walk away with nothing. She did not even try to hide it. She wanted Emily to see. If you believe in justice, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Emily Whitmore was not a woman who cried easily. She had learned over the course of 18 years of marriage how to hold herself together when everything around her was quietly falling apart. She had learned how to smile at charity dinners when she felt hollow inside. She had learned how to answer questions about her husband's latest development projects with enthusiasm she did not feel. She had learned most painfully how to pretend that everything was fine when the man sleeping beside her every night had stopped seeing her years ago. But on the morning of September 14th, standing in the hallway outside Courtroom 7 in the Suffolk County Courthouse in downtown Boston, Emily felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Pure, cold, absolute rage. Not the hot kind. Not the kind that makes you scream or cry or throw things across the room. The cold kind. The kind that settles in your chest like a stone and sharpens every thought you have into something precise and dangerous. She was 44 years old. She was wearing a navy dress she had chosen carefully because her attorney had told her to look composed, professional, and dignified. Her hair was pulled back, her hands were steady, and her eyes were fixed on a woman 20 feet ahead of her who was adjusting a sapphire necklace at the base of her throat, a necklace Emily had last seen inside a velvet box in her own bedroom. Emily had stood in that bedroom 6 months ago, staring at the empty space where her grandmother's jewelry case used to be, and she had cried. She had cried because the necklace was irreplaceable, because her grandmother had pressed it into her hands on the day of Emily's wedding and said, "This has survived harder things than you can imagine. It will protect you." Because the insurance payout that was supposed to compensate her for the loss felt like being handed a price tag for a piece of her own history. Now here it was, around Samantha Pierce's neck. Emily turned slightly toward her attorney, Rachel Morgan, who was standing beside her reviewing notes on a legal pad. Rachel was 51 years old, sharp-faced with silver streaks in her dark hair, and the kind of calm that made opposing attorneys nervous. She had been practicing family law in Boston for 22 years. She had seen everything, or so Emily had thought until Emily grabbed her arm right there in the courthouse hallway and whispered, barely breathing, "Rachel, look at her necklace." Rachel looked up from her legal pad. She looked at Samantha Pierce standing across the hallway, laughing quietly at something Richard's attorney was saying, one hand raised to touch the blue stones at her throat, with a gesture that was almost casual, almost possessive. Rachel's expression did not change, not visibly, but her eyes became very still. "Is that—" Emily started. "Don't say another word." Rachel's voice was almost inaudible. "Not here, not in the hallway. Go to the bathroom and wait for me. Do not look at her again." "Rachel, that's my grandmother's." "I know what it is." Rachel's hand found Emily's arm steady and firm, "and she just handed us everything we need. Go, now." Emily turned and walked toward the restroom at the far end of the corridor. She did not look back. But she heard Samantha laugh again behind her, that easy, unaware laugh of a woman who believed she had already won, and Emily's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had not always hated Samantha Pierce. That was the complicated truth that Emily had spent 6 months trying to make sense of. In the beginning, when she first heard the name, when she first found the text messages buried in Richard's phone while he was in the shower, a cascade of messages that went back nearly 2 years, she had felt sick, but her hatred had been directed entirely at Richard. Samantha had been an abstraction then, a name, a problem that existed somewhere outside her life. But Samantha had a way of making herself very real very quickly. It started with small things. A comment on one of Richard's social media posts that lingered a beat too long. A photograph that Emily found on a shared cloud account that Richard had forgotten to lock, not inappropriate but intimate, the way two people stand next to each other at a company event when they know each other far better than the context suggests. Then the phone calls to their house landline, always in the evening, always when Richard was home, always hanging up when Emily answered. By the time Emily confronted Richard with everything she had found, Samantha had already stopped being an abstraction. She had become the reason Emily sat in her car in the parking garage of their building at 2 a.m, unable to go upstairs. The reason Emily's sister Carolyn had flown in from Phoenix and held Emily's hand while Emily shook with something that went beyond crying. The reason Emily had spent the last 6 months feeling like she was carrying a wound that would never fully close. "Did you ever love me?" Emily had asked Richard the night everything came apart. They were standing in the kitchen of the house they had bought together 14 years ago, the house where they had talked about having children and never quite gotten around to it. The house where Emily had hosted dinner parties for his clients and organized fundraisers for his company's charitable arm and done every single invisible thing that allowed Richard Caldwell's empire to look as polished and perfect as it did. Richard had stood there by the kitchen island, with his hand resting on the granite countertop and his face doing that thing it did when he was calculating, not feeling calculating, and he had said, "I cared about you, Emily. I still do, but people change. People change. 18 years. And that was what she got." "She's 29 years old, Richard." Emily's voice had been very quiet. "She is 15 years younger than me. Do you even... This isn't about age. Then what is it about?" He had looked at her with something that might have been guilt or might have been exhaustion, and he had said, "I think we should talk to lawyers." That had been the moment. Not the text messages, not the photograph, not the late-night hang-up calls. That one sentence, "I think we should talk to lawyers," delivered in the same calm managerial tone he used to close real estate deals. That was the moment Emily understood that whatever she had believed their marriage to be, Richard had stopped living inside it long before she found out. Rachel came into the restroom less than 4 minutes later. Emily was standing at the sink running cold water over her wrists, an old habit from her mother, who had always said cold water on the wrists was better than any medication for calming yourself down. Rachel locked the door behind her, which was unusual enough that Emily turned to look at her. "Tell me everything you remember about the necklace," Rachel said. "Vintage sapphire pendant," Emily said. "Art Deco setting, white gold. The clasp was repaired twice. There's a slightly different metal at the back of the clasp because my grandmother had it fixed in 2 different decades. The stones are arranged in a fan shape. There are 11 sapphires. The center stone is the largest. It came with documentation provenance documents because it was insured separately from the rest of the collection." Rachel was writing everything down. "Where are the provenance documents?" "I have copies. My sister has the originals." "I need them before we walk into that courtroom." Emily stared at her. "You have them. I gave them to you 3 weeks ago with the insurance report." Rachel looked up from her legal pad. Something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, except Rachel was too controlled to let satisfaction show this early. "I did receive them," Rachel said. "I wanted to confirm you knew exactly what we were dealing with. I wanted to hear you describe it." She paused. "The description you just gave me matches the necklace Samantha Pierce is wearing in the hallway." "I know it does. 11 sapphires, fan arrangement, repaired clasp." "I know what I saw." Rachel capped her pen. "Emily, I need you to understand something. What is happening in this hallway right now is either the luckiest thing that has ever happened in this case, or it is confirmation of something I have suspected for 3 months. Either way, when we walk into that courtroom, I need you to sit at that table and show nothing. Not recognition, not anger, not triumph, nothing." "She's wearing my grandmother's necklace," Emily said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "And she walked in here to watch Richard take everything from me." "Yes," Rachel said, "and she is about to learn that she brought every piece of evidence we needed with her." Richard Caldwell was by any external measure a success story. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Worcester, Massachusetts, the second of 4 children, and he had put himself through college on a combination of academic scholarships and construction work during summers. He was genuinely intelligent. Emily had never doubted that. He could read a piece of property before he ever walked through the door, could calculate a return on investment in his head faster than most people could open a spreadsheet, and he had an almost supernatural ability to make people trust him in a room. That last quality Emily had come to understand was also the most dangerous thing about him. Because Richard did not manipulate people the way that villains in movies manipulate people. He did not twist words or make threats. He simply became whatever the room needed him to be. With investors, he was visionary and bold. With bankers, he was cautious and detail-oriented. With city officials, he was community-minded and civic. And with Emily, for the first several years of their marriage, he had been warm and attentive and seemingly genuine in a way that she had believed completely. She had been so certain of him. That certainty was part of what made the betrayal so disorienting. It was not just that he had lied about the affair. It was that he had been lying about his nature for so long that Emily had never developed the instinct to doubt him. She had trusted him the way you trust the ground under your feet, not as a conscious choice, but as a condition of life. And when the ground opened up, she had no idea how far she was going to fall. The divorce proceedings had been going on for 4 months. In that time, Richard's attorney, a prominent Boston divorce lawyer named Gerald Fitch, who was known for aggressive asset protection strategies, had systematically challenged every piece of Emily's contribution to the marriage. Emily had not worked outside the home since the first 2 years they were married. She had given up her position as an events coordinator at a downtown hotel when Richard's business began growing, and the demands on her time as his partner, his host, his organizational anchor became impossible to balance with a separate career. At the time, it had felt like a shared decision, a partnership, something they had chosen together because they were building something together. Gerald Fitch had spent 4 months painting it as dependency. In deposition after deposition, he had questioned Emily's ability to manage finances, suggested that her emotional state during the marriage had been a burden on Richard's professional effectiveness, and argued that Emily's claim to a substantial share of the marital assets was fundamentally unreasonable, given that she had not contributed to the business directly. Emily had sat through every one of those depositions with her hands folded in her lap and said exactly what Rachel told her to say, and not one word more. But each session had taken something out of her, something small and specific and impossible to name, like the way a fever takes something from you even after it breaks. She had told Rachel after the 4th deposition, "I feel like they're trying to convince me I didn't exist." Rachel had looked at her steadily and said, "That is exactly what they are trying to do, and they are going to fail." Emily had wanted to believe her. Now standing in a courthouse bathroom, looking at her own reflection, while her attorney prepared to walk into the most important legal proceeding of her adult life, she wondered what Rachel knew that she was not yet saying. "The insurance investigation," Emily said suddenly. Rachel looked up. "You told me 3 months ago that you were looking into the burglary separately, as part of the divorce case." Emily paused. "You said you had found some inconsistencies. You never told me what they were." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't want to tell you until I was certain." "Tell me now." Another pause. Rachel set her legal pad on the counter beside the sink. She looked at Emily directly the way she always did when she was about to say something she had considered very carefully. "The burglary happened on March 3rd, Rachel said. "You were in Phoenix with your sister. The alarm system on your home was disarmed at 11:47 p.m. using the correct access code." Emily felt something move in her chest. "Richard was the only other person who had the code," she said. "Correct. He told the police he was traveling. He said he was in New York at a conference." "He was registered at a hotel in New York," Rachel said carefully. "But the hotel's keycard records show that his room key was not used after 8:15 p.m. on the night of the burglary, and the conference's own sign-in sheets show that he skipped the dinner event that evening." Emily felt the cold stone in her chest grow heavier. "He drove back," she said, "or he had someone do it." "We believe someone used the code on his behalf," Rachel said. "And we believe that your jewelry was not sold or dispersed in the way that stolen items typically are. We believe it was retained, held, given as a gift." The word gift hung in the air between them. Emily looked at her own reflection in the mirror. She looked very calm. She felt very calm in the strange, eerie way that you feel calm when something so enormous happens that your nervous system simply cannot process it in real time. "She walked in wearing it," Emily said. "She actually walked in here wearing it." "Yes," Rachel said. "She thought she was taunting me." "Yes." Emily turned away from the mirror. "How long have you known?" "I have suspected for 11 weeks, Rachel said. "I have had confirmation for 6 days, and I have been waiting for today." "Why today?" Rachel picked up her legal pad. She straightened her jacket. She moved toward the bathroom door with the precise, deliberate energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to have a very specific conversation. Because today, Rachel said, is the first time Samantha Pierce will be in the same room as the evidence against her. And because today, the man I hired to get that evidence is going to sit in that witness box and testify under oath. She paused with her hand on the door. And because today, Emily, you are going to watch Richard Caldwell's entire constructed reality collapse around him, publicly, in front of a judge. Emily said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need me to do?" "Walk in there," Rachel said. "Sit down, and do not let them see anything on your face until I tell you to." The courtroom was not what Emily had expected the first time she walked into it. She had expected something dramatic, high ceilings, dark wood, the kind of imposing architecture that announces that serious things happen here. Courtroom 7 in the Suffolk County Courthouse was practical rather than dramatic. Drop ceiling with fluorescent lights, beige walls that had been painted at least 3 times in recent decades, rows of wooden benches for spectators, most of them worn smooth by years of people sitting and waiting and hoping. A judge's bench that was elevated but not by as much as you would think. A witness box that looked almost too small for the weight of the things people said inside it. Emily walked in ahead of Rachel and took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Across the center aisle at the defense table, Richard was already seated. Gerald Fitch was beside him, reviewing a stack of papers, his reading glasses pushed down on his nose. Richard was wearing a charcoal suit that Emily recognized she had picked it out for him for a charity gala 3 years ago. His posture was relaxed. His expression was neutral in the practiced way of someone who had been coached to perform neutrality. He did not look at Emily. In the gallery behind Richard's table, Samantha Pierce had settled into the second row of spectator benches. She had crossed one leg over the other and was scrolling through her phone with the easy confidence of someone attending an event she expected to find boring because she already knew the outcome. Emily looked at her exactly once. She looked at the necklace. 11 sapphires arranged in a fan shape around a center stone that caught the fluorescent light and held it. Then Emily looked away, folded her hands on the table in front of her, and waited. Judge Thomas Reynolds entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. How was a man in his mid-60s, compact and precise, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular expression of someone who has heard many lies in many courtrooms, and developed a corresponding patience for waiting until the truth reveals itself. He was known among Boston family law practitioners for 2 things: his refusal to be charmed by high-profile attorneys and his meticulous attention to financial documentation. Rachel had chosen this courtroom. Emily had not fully understood until this moment why. "Court is in session," the bailiff announced. "The matter of Whitmore versus Caldwell." Gerald Fitch stood and began his opening presentation with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this many times. Richard Caldwell, he argued, had built everything he had through his own intelligence and effort. Emily Whitmore had been a supportive spouse, but had not been a professional partner in the business. The assets she was claiming were disproportionate to her contribution. The suggestion that Richard had any involvement in the household burglary was a desperate, unfounded accusation designed to poison the court against a man who simply wanted to move forward with his life. Fitch spoke for 22 minutes. He was good. Emily could acknowledge that even now. He was persuasive and organized, and he had a gift for making the complicated simple without losing nuance. When he finished, Rachel stood. She spoke for 9 minutes. She was quieter than Fitch, more deliberate. She moved through Emily's contribution to the marriage not as an argument, but as a sequence of facts documented, specific, dated. The events Emily had organized and what they generated for Richard's business. The network Emily had built among Boston's philanthropic and real estate communities that had directly led to 4 of Richard's largest contract relationships. The years of operational management that had allowed Richard to travel constantly and focus entirely on deal-making. The numbers behind each of those contributions pulled from Richard's own business records. Then at the very end, Rachel said simply, "We will also be presenting evidence today that significantly changes the nature of this proceeding. Evidence that speaks not only to the distribution of marital assets, but to criminal conduct that directly affected my client." Gerald Fitch looked up from his papers. Richard's posture for the first time shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Judge Reynolds looked at Rachel over his glasses. "What kind of evidence, counselor?" "Physical evidence," Rachel said. "Financial records, and the testimony of a witness." The judge nodded once. "Proceed." Rachel turned back toward her table. Emily was watching Richard. She saw the exact moment. His certainty cracked, not broke, just cracked. A hairline fracture in the performance of a man who had built his entire life on the confidence that he could control every situation he walked into. His jaw tightened, his right hand resting on the defense table pressed flat against the surface. He was realizing, Emily thought. He was beginning to realize that something had gone wrong, but he did not know yet what it was. And Samantha, still in the gallery, still scrolling through her phone, still wearing the necklace, had not yet understood that the trap had already closed around her. She would understand soon enough. Rachel called Richard Caldwell to the stand first. This was Emily knew deliberate. Rachel had explained it to her in the weeks leading up to the hearing. You get the story from the person telling the lie first. You let them commit to it fully in front of the judge under oath. You let them build the structure of the lie as carefully as they can, and then you take it apart piece by piece in the sequence that causes the most damage. Richard straightened his jacket as he took the witness stand. He sat comfortably. He folded his hands. He looked at the judge rather than at Emily, which was also practiced, also deliberate. Gerald Fitch walked him through the account they had prepared. Richard described the marriage as having been warm, but ultimately incompatible. He described himself as having grown professionally, while Emily had been unwilling to adapt. He described the affair with Samantha carefully, because denying it would have been legally pointless, as something that had begun only after the marriage had effectively ended, only after both he and Emily had acknowledged privately that they were no longer working as partners. "When did you first become involved with Samantha Pierce?" Fitch asked. "After Emily and I had agreed that the marriage was over," Richard said. "We weren't officially separated yet, but we had had the conversation." "And the burglary at the marital home?" Richard's expression became appropriately grave. "Terrible thing. Emily was devastated, and so was I. We lost a lot of things that night that couldn't be replaced." "Did you have any involvement in that burglary?" "Absolutely not." The answer was immediate, firm, and delivered with a quality of injured disbelief that was Emily had to acknowledge very well performed. "And have you ever given Samantha Pierce any item that was formerly the property of your wife?" "No." Same firmness, same injured quality. "I would never do something like that." Richard looked comfortable. He looked like a man whose story was holding. Then Rachel stood up. She walked toward the witness stand with the unhurried pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they already know exactly where they are going. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you testified that your relationship with Samantha Pierce began after your marriage had effectively ended. Is that correct?" "Yes." "After the conversation, you say you and Emily had privately acknowledging the marriage wasn't working." "That's right." "And this conversation, when did it take place?" Richard gave a date. "Early January 2 years ago." Rachel nodded. "And the burglary occurred in March of this year?" "Yes." "So at the time of the burglary, you and Samantha Pierce had been involved for approximately 14 months. A brief hesitation. Something like that. Not just an employee at that point." "No." He said it carefully. "By then, things had developed." "Things had developed," Rachel repeated. She said it without any particular inflection, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Caldwell, on the night of March 3rd, where were you?" "New York. I've been over this. I was at a conference." "You were registered at the conference hotel?" "Yes, we have those records." Rachel turned to the clerk and submitted a document. "These are the hotel keycard records for your room. Can you explain why your room key was not used after 8:15 p.m. that evening?" Richard's expression remained controlled. "I may have gone out. I don't remember every detail of a business trip from 6 months ago." "You went out," Rachel said, "at 8:15 in the evening from a hotel in New York, and you don't remember where?" "I may have gone to dinner with a colleague." "Which colleague?" "I don't recall." "The conference had a formal dinner event that evening. Sign-in records from the event show you were not present." "I skipped it. Those events aren't always mandatory." "Of course." Rachel moved on smoothly. "Let me ask you about the insurance claim. After the burglary, a claim was filed for Emily's jewelry collection. The claim was processed, and a payment was issued. Do you remember the amount? Roughly, it was a significant amount. $342,000, Rachel said. "Give or take, for the collection as a whole." She paused. "Where did that payment go, Mr. Caldwell?" "Into the household account, I assume. Emily handled the insurance." "Emily handled the claim filing," Rachel said. "But the payment was disbursed to the account registered with the insurance company, which was the joint household account at the time. Can you tell me why, when I subpoena the records of that account, the insurance payment does not appear?" Richard looked at Fitch. The look was very quick, but the judge saw it, Rachel saw it, Emily saw it. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Richard said carefully. "There may have been account changes." "There may have been account changes," Rachel said. "Mr. Caldwell, are you familiar with a company called Harborview Management Group, LLC?" A beat. Just one beat of silence. But it was the wrong beat. "I have several LLCs associated with my business interests," Richard said. "Harborview Management Group, LLC was registered in Delaware 14 months ago," Rachel said, submitting another document. "The registered agent is a law firm that has handled your corporate filings for a number of years. The signatory on the operating agreement is," she paused for effect, "you. I may have that entity. I have several." The insurance payment of $342,000 was transferred from the joint household account to Harborview Management Group, LLC, within 72 hours of being received, Rachel said, after which the joint household account shows no further record of those funds. The courtroom was very quiet. "I'd need to review those records," Richard said. "I have them here," Rachel said pleasantly. She handed a full packet to the clerk. "Certified copies. I also have the wire transfer records from the Harborview account showing subsequent disbursements," she paused, "including transfers to a personal account associated with Samantha Pierce." In the gallery behind Richard, Samantha Pierce stopped scrolling. Her hand went still on her phone. She looked up. She looked at Richard's back. Her expression changed. Emily, watching from across the courtroom, saw it happen, the beginning of understanding moving across Samantha's face like a shadow. "Your Honor," Gerald Fitch said, standing, "I'd like to request a recess to review these documents." "Denied," Judge Reynolds said. He had been watching everything behind his wire-rimmed glasses with the quiet attention of a man who had been doing this for a very long time and recognized exactly what he was seeing. "Continue, Counselor." Rachel looked at Richard Caldwell on the witness stand. Richard was still performing calm, but his hands, Emily noticed, were no longer resting comfortably on the railing. They were pressed against it, gripping it. "Mr. Caldwell," Rachel said, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Have you ever given Samantha Pierce any item that was formerly the property of your wife?" Richard looked at Fitch. Fitch said nothing. There was nothing to say. Richard looked back at Rachel. "I need to consult with my attorney," he said. "You can certainly do that after your testimony," Rachel said. She turned to Judge Reynolds. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to call her first witness." And from somewhere across the courtroom in the second row of the spectator benches, Emily heard the small, sharp sound of a woman who had believed herself safe, suddenly understanding that she was not. Samantha Pierce's hand had gone to her throat, to the necklace. And in that single involuntary gesture, that reaching for the thing she should never have worn, she had confirmed everything. Rachel turned toward the courtroom entrance. "The plaintiff calls Daniel Harper." Daniel Harper walked into courtroom 7, the way a man walks into a room when he knows exactly what he is carrying and exactly what it is going to do. I was not particularly tall. He was not particularly dramatic. He wore a dark gray suit that was clean and pressed but not expensive, the kind of suit a man chooses when he wants to be taken seriously without being noticed. He was 47 years old, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that gave nothing away unless he decided to give something. He carried a leather folder under his left arm and a cardboard evidence box in both hands, and he walked to the front of the courtroom without looking at Richard, without looking at Samantha, without looking at anyone except Judge Reynolds. Emily watched him cross the room. She had never seen him before in her life, and yet somehow watching him set that evidence box on the edge of the clerk's table, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has handled important things many times before, she felt something she had not felt in months. She felt like the ground under her feet was solid again. Behind her in the gallery she heard a sound, small, involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when air leaves their body faster than they intended. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She knew exactly who had made it. Samantha Pierce had just seen Daniel Harper's face. Rachel Morgan stood at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded in front of her, watching the witness settle himself in the box, and she said nothing. She was very good at silence. She used it the way a surgeon uses precision, not as an absence of action, but as action itself. Judge Reynolds looked at the witness. "State your name for the record." "Daniel Harper." And your occupation? I am a licensed private financial investigator. I specialize in asset concealment, fraudulent transfers, and financial fraud in civil and family law proceedings. He paused. I have been doing this work for 19 years. Gerald Fitch was already on his feet. Your Honor, the defense has not been given adequate notice of this witness. Counselor, Judge Reynolds said without raising his voice. Mr. Harper's name appeared on the plaintiff's witness list filed 11 days ago. Your objection is noted and overruled. Sit down. Fitch sat. Richard leaned toward him and said something very quietly. Fitch shook his head slightly. Richard's jaw tightened. Rachel approached the witness stand. Mr. Harper, she said, can you describe how you came to be involved in this case? I was retained by plaintiff's counsel approximately 14 weeks ago, Daniel said. I was asked to conduct a financial investigation into the asset structure of Richard Caldwell's business holdings, with particular attention to any recent account movements, newly formed entities, or unusual transfers that occurred in the period surrounding the separation of the parties. And did you conduct that investigation? I did. What did you find? Daniel opened his leather folder. He was precise about it, not theatrical, just precise. I identified 17 distinct financial entities connected to Richard Caldwell, including 4 LLCs registered in Delaware, 2 in Nevada, and 1 registered in the Cayman Islands through an intermediary structure. Of those 17 entities, 3 had been created within the 24 months preceding this hearing. What significance does the timing of those creations carry? In my experience, Daniel said, entities created during the period leading up to a divorce proceeding frequently serve as vehicles for moving marital assets outside the reach of equitable distribution. Objection, Fitch said. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Reynolds said. Stick to what you found, Mr. Harper, not characterizations. Daniel nodded once, completely unfazed. I'll speak to what the records show. One of the 3 newly created entities, Harborview Management Group, LLC, received a wire transfer of $342,000 from the joint marital account of the parties on March 7th of this year. And what was the origin of those funds? The funds had been received 4 days earlier as an insurance disbursement, specifically a claim payment for stolen jewelry belonging to Emily Whitmore. The courtroom was very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being respectful, the loaded quiet of people holding their breath. What happened to those funds after they reached Harborview Management Group, LLC? Daniel turned a page in his folder. $68,000 was transferred to a general operating account associated with Caldwell Properties within 5 days. $211,000 remained in the Harborview account for approximately 3 weeks, after which it was disbursed in 4 separate transfers. He paused. The remaining $63,000 was transferred to a personal checking account. Rachel let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Whose personal checking account, Mr. Harper? The account is registered to Samantha Pierce. In the gallery, the sound was not small this time. Several people shifted. Someone exhaled audibly. A woman 2 rows behind Samantha Pierce leaned to the person beside her and whispered something. The bailiff moved slightly instinctively in the direction of maintaining order. Samantha did not move. She sat completely still with her hand at her throat and her eyes fixed on the back of Richard's head, and Emily, who was watching the gallery in her peripheral vision, thought that Samantha looked like a person who had just realized they were standing on ice that was much thinner than they had thought. Richard was looking at the table in front of him. Not at Fitch, not at the witness, not at the judge, at the table. At the flat surface of the defense table, where his hand was pressed palm down with a pressure that was doing something visible to the tendons in his wrist. Mr. Harper, Rachel continued, and her voice was still perfectly even. In the course of your investigation, did your work extend beyond financial records? It did, Daniel said. Can you describe the nature of that extended investigation? Over a period of approximately 9 weeks, I maintained contact with Samantha Pierce under a pretext identity, Daniel said. Specifically, I represented myself as a private equity consultant interested in a potential business opportunity. Ms. Pierce and I met on 6 separate occasions, and we had numerous phone and text communications over that period. Every single person in the courtroom was absolutely still. Emily felt Rachel's presence beside her as a kind of anchor, something steady in the center of a room that was tilting. "Why did you take that approach?" Rachel asked. "Because the financial records I had found pointed strongly to a collaborative arrangement between Mr. Caldwell and Ms. Pierce regarding the disposition of the stolen jewelry and the insurance proceeds," Daniel said. "But financial records tell you what happened. They don't always tell you why or how or who knew what. I needed to understand the full picture." "And during your 9 weeks of contact with Ms. Pierce, what did you learn?" Daniel turned another page. "Ms. Pierce discussed the jewelry on 3 separate occasions," he said. "On the first occasion, she described receiving what she called a gift from Richard during the period following the burglary. She described the gift as significant and indicated that it included several pieces. On the second occasion, she described one specific piece as a sapphire necklace, which she said Richard had told her was a family heirloom that Emily would never miss because she had too many things anyway." The sound Emily made was not audible, but Rachel put her hand on Emily's arm very briefly, very lightly. A touch that said, "I know, stay with me." "On the third occasion," Daniel continued, "Ms. Pierce made a comment that I believe is directly relevant to the question of her knowledge at the time she received the items. She stated, and I am reading from a contemporaneous note I made within 2 hours of that conversation, she stated, 'He told me the insurance would cover everything. I figured if the insurance paid out, then technically nobody was losing anything. The wife gets the money, I get the jewelry. What's the problem?'" The silence that followed was the kind that does not feel like silence at all. It feels like pressure. Judge Reynolds removed his glasses, looked at them, and put them back on. Emily stared at the witness stand and thought about her grandmother's hands, about the way her grandmother had fastened that necklace around Emily's neck on the morning of her wedding and said that the stones had survived the Depression and a world war and 2 ocean crossings, and that things which survive hard times carry that strength with them. She had believed that. She had believed it with the uncomplicated certainty of a woman in her mid-20s who had not yet understood how much could be taken from you by people you trusted. "The wife gets the money, I get the jewelry. What's the problem?" Rachel said quietly, "Were you able to make recordings of any of these conversations, Mr. Harper?" "Yes," Daniel said. "All 6 in-person meetings were recorded with appropriate legal authorization. Selected text message exchanges were also preserved. I have provided copies of the relevant recordings and transcripts to plaintiff's counsel, which have been disclosed to the defense pursuant to discovery obligations." Fitch stood. "Your Honor, the defense has serious concerns about the admissibility of recordings obtained through counselor." Judge Reynolds's voice was patient in the way that very experienced authority figures are patient with a bedrock of something unyielding underneath. "The recordings and transcripts were disclosed in discovery. You have had 11 days to file a motion to suppress. No such motion was filed. The evidence is admissible. Sit down." Fitch sat down again. This time Richard did not lean over to speak to him. This time Richard did not move at all. Emily realized, watching him from across the courtroom, that she was witnessing something she had never seen in 18 years of marriage. She was watching Richard Caldwell not know what to do. The man who always had a next move, always had an angle, always had a version of the story that served him. That man was sitting at a defense table with his hand flat on the surface and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and he had nothing. It should have felt like victory. It felt like grief, clean and uncomplicated and 20 years overdue. Rachel turned back to the witness. "Mr. Harper, in your professional opinion, based on the financial records you reviewed and the information you gathered during your contact with Ms. Pierce, what conclusions have you reached about the disposition of Emily Whitmore's stolen jewelry?" "In my professional opinion," Daniel said without hesitation, "the jewelry was removed from the marital home with advance coordination. The insurance claim was filed and collected with knowledge that the reported theft was not a conventional burglary. The proceeds of the insurance claim were deliberately moved through a newly created corporate entity to obscure their origin and destination. And the physical items, the jewelry itself, were retained and transferred to Samantha Pierce as a private gift with the intent that their true origin would not be discovered. And the necklace currently being worn by Miss Pierce in this courtroom today." Gerald Fitch was on his feet before Rachel could finish the sentence. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is assuming facts, not in evidence. "The necklace is in evidence," Rachel said calmly, and she turned and addressed the clerk. "Plaintiff submits Exhibit 14 provenance documentation for a vintage sapphire necklace. Art Deco period 11 stones white gold setting with a repaired clasp, insured separately under policy number," she read the number, "as part of Emily Whitmore's personal jewelry collection. The insurance records and original purchase documentation describe this piece in specific detail, including a notated repair to the clasp undertaken in 1987. She paused. "I would ask the court to note that the necklace currently being worn by Samantha Pierce in the gallery is a sapphire necklace with an Art Deco setting." Another pause. "Your Honor, I would request that the court's bailiff secure that item pending formal examination." Judge Reynolds looked at the gallery. Samantha Pierce was not moving. Her hand was at her throat, both hands now, not stroking the necklace the way she had been in the hallway, covering it, holding it, like a person who knows something is about to be taken from them and is making one last involuntary effort to hold on. The judge said, "Ms. Pierce, you will need to surrender that item to the bailiff." Samantha did not respond immediately. The bailiff took 2 steps toward the gallery. Emily watched Samantha look at Richard's back, just for a moment, just a flash of something not love, not even anger, something more complicated than either. The look of a person who has just fully understood that the arrangement they believed protected them, protected only one person, and it was not them. Then Samantha reached up, unclasped the necklace with hands that were not quite steady, and placed it in the bailiff's outstretched hand. The courtroom exhaled. Emily felt Rachel's hand touch her arm again. Once, brief. The necklace was placed in an evidence bag, tagged, documented. Emily watched it cross the room and thought, there you are after everything. Judge Reynolds addressed the courtroom. "We'll take a 15-minute recess. Counsel for both parties will remain available. Ms. Pierce, you will not leave this building." He looked at her directly. "Do you understand?" Samantha said barely audibly, "Yes." The gavel came down. The room broke open. Gerald Fitch grabbed Richard's arm the moment the judge left the bench, and the two of them moved into urgent, low-voiced conference at the defense table. Emily could not hear what they were saying. She did not need to. The posture told her everything. Fitch leaning in, Richard leaning away, both of them tight with the particular tension of men who are trying to find a door out of a room that has no doors. Rachel turned to Emily. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Emily said. And then, I don't know what I am right now." "That's honest," Rachel said. "She really said that. What's the problem?" "She said it," Rachel confirmed. "She thought the insurance money made it fine." Emily's voice was level, but only because she was making a conscious effort to keep it level. She thought as long as the money was paid out, there was nothing wrong with what they did. "Yes. My grandmother carried that necklace across an ocean." "I know. She wore it on the day she became an American citizen." Emily stopped. She pressed her lips together. "And Samantha Pierce put it on this morning to come here and watch me lose." Rachel said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She's not watching you lose today." "No," Emily said. "She's not." Across the room. Richard finally looked at Emily for the first time since the hearing had begun. It was a brief look, almost involuntary, the way Daniel Harper's testimony had produced involuntary sounds and gestures from everyone in the room. Richard looked at Emily, and Emily looked back at him, and the look lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Richard turned away. She did not know what she had wanted to see in his face. Whatever it was not there. What was there was something smaller and more human than she had expected. Not guilt exactly, and not shame exactly. Something more like the expression of a man who has just recognized very late how badly he miscalculated. She looked away first. Not because she had to, because she had already seen everything she needed to see. During the recess, Rachel pulled a junior associate aside and gave 3 rapid instructions that Emily did not fully hear. The associate left the courtroom quickly. Daniel Harper remained in the witness box area, reviewing his folder, talking quietly with Rachel's paralegal. 2 court officers positioned themselves closer to the gallery than they had been before the recess, and Emily noticed that Samantha had been joined by a woman Emily did not recognize. Not a friend from the look of the interaction, but someone who had the specific demeanor of a person delivering information that the recipient does not want. An attorney. Someone had gotten Samantha an attorney in the 15-minute recess. Emily turned to Rachel when she returned. "She's getting representation." Good, Rachel said. That means she's afraid. Is that good for us? A frightened person with a lawyer is better than a frightened person without one, Rachel said. A lawyer will tell her to stop talking, which means the damage is already done, and she cannot make it worse for herself in a way that might create sympathy. Rachel sat down and spread her notes in front of her. The recordings are what they are. The financial records are what they are. What she does from this point forward is her business. What about Richard? Rachel looked at Emily directly. Richard is standing at the edge of something he built himself, she said, and today he is going to watch it come down. When court resumed, Judge Reynolds called the session back to order with an efficiency that suggested he had been giving the situation considerable thought during the recess. He looked at Gerald Fitch. Counselor, does your client wish to modify any of the testimony he offered this morning? Fitch and Richard had another brief whispered exchange. Then Fitch stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to request a continuance of... Denied, Judge Reynolds said. Your client testified under oath this morning. He has been presented with documentary and testimonial evidence that directly contradicts several points of that testimony. I am not inclined to grant additional time for the construction of alternative explanations. He looked at Richard. Mr. Caldwell, you are still under oath. I will remind you of the consequences of perjury. Richard said nothing. Rachel stood. Your Honor, the plaintiff requests that the court take judicial notice of the evidence presented and issue an immediate order, freezing all accounts and assets associated with Harborview Management Group, LLC, and the other newly created entities identified in Mr. Harper's report, pending full forensic accounting. So ordered, Judge Reynolds said without pausing. Fitch stood again. Your Honor, the order stands, Counselor. The judge made a note. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to insurance fraud and the concealment of marital assets. He looked up. This court does not look kindly on the use of deliberate criminal conduct to manipulate family law proceedings. Mr. Caldwell, I would suggest you speak very carefully with your attorney about the position you are now in. Richard's face had gone the particular shade of gray that expensive suits cannot conceal. Emily looked at her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had imagined this moment many times in the past 4 months. She had imagined feeling triumphant. She had imagined feeling vindicated. She had imagined in her worst moments feeling cruel satisfaction at seeing Richard's certainty collapse. She did not feel any of those things. She felt exhausted. She felt sad in a way that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with the 18 years that had led to it. She felt the particular sadness of a woman who had loved a man faithfully for a very long time and was only now in a courtroom finally accepting that the man she had loved had never fully existed. But underneath the exhaustion, underneath the grief, there was something else, something quiet and steady that had been building since the moment in the courthouse hallway when she had seen that necklace around Samantha's throat, and Rachel had said, "Don't say a word. She just handed us everything." She recognized it now, sitting at that table with the gavel down, and Richard's empire beginning to fracture along every seam. It was the feeling of standing on solid ground. After 18 years of learning to balance on surfaces that turned out to be water, she was standing on something real, something that was hers. Something no one had the power to take away, because it was not a house or a jewelry collection or a financial settlement. It was the truth about who she was. It was the record of what she had survived. Rachel touched her arm and said quietly, "Emily, we are not done. There's still the matter of the full asset disclosure." Emily nodded. "I know. Are you with me?" Emily looked up. Across the room, Richard was speaking to Fitch in the low, rapid tones of a man trying to find options in a situation that has run out of them. In the gallery, Samantha sat with her new attorney in a posture that had nothing left of the morning's confidence. The evidence bag containing the sapphire necklace sat on the clerk's table with a tag on it waiting. "Yes," Emily said, "I'm with you." She turned back to face the front of the courtroom, where Judge Reynolds was reviewing documents with the focused attention of a man who has decided that something important needs to be done correctly and thoroughly. Outside the courtroom windows, the city of Boston went on being itself, traffic and voices, and the ordinary noise of a Thursday morning in September. Inside, everything was about to change for 3 people who had made choices in the dark, certain they would never be seen. Rachel was already on her feet. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff would like to continue with the examination of financial records." and the morning pressed forward steady and unstoppable toward the full weight of what Richard Caldwell had spent 2 years trying to avoid. Emily breathed. She thought of her grandmother's hands. She thought of 11 sapphires in a fan shape, carrying the strength of everything they had survived, and she waited for justice to finish what truth had started. The financial records Rachel Morgan had subpoenaed were not a single document. They were 47 pages of wire transfers, account statements, LLC operating agreements, and corporate registration filings, and Rachel had spent 3 weeks organizing them into a sequence that told a story so clear and so damning that even a person with no legal training could follow it from beginning to end. She began presenting them to Judge Reynolds at 10:23 in the morning. Richard Caldwell sat at the defense table and watched his own financial history get laid out in front of a judge page by page, and Emily watched him watching it, and she thought about something Rachel had told her during their very first meeting nearly 5 months ago. Rachel had said, "The most dangerous thing a dishonest person can do is spend years believing they are smarter than everyone around them, because the longer they believe it, the more careless they become, and carelessness always leaves a trail." The trail Richard had left was extraordinary in its detail. It was not the trail of a stupid man. Emily had never thought Richard was stupid. It was the trail of a man who was extremely intelligent in the specific domain of real estate development and deeply, catastrophically overconfident in every other domain. He had structured his hidden accounts with genuine sophistication. The layers of LLCs, the interstate registrations, the use of intermediary law firms, all of it showed real planning. But underneath the sophistication at every critical juncture, there were decisions that only made sense if you believed absolutely that no one was looking. He had moved the insurance money through Harborview because he thought Emily would never connect the dots between an LLC registered in Delaware and her own stolen jewelry. He had given Samantha the necklace because he thought Samantha would have the sense to keep it in a drawer. He had structured his hidden assets assuming that Emily, whom he had spent years characterizing as financially naive, would walk into this divorce proceeding without the resources or the knowledge to find what he had buried. He had been wrong about all of it. Every single assumption had been wrong. Rachel stood before the court and walked through each transfer with the patience of someone who has prepared so thoroughly that no question can surprise her. She explained the Delaware registration structure. She explained the wire transfer sequence. She introduced the forensic accountant's report, a 40-page document prepared by a certified fraud examiner who had spent 6 weeks reconstructing the movement of approximately $2.3 million through Richard's hidden entity network over the preceding 2 years. $2.3 million, not the $342,000 from the insurance claim. That had been one piece, one transfer, one crime among a larger pattern of deliberate asset concealment that had been ongoing since Richard first understood that his marriage was going to end, and that Emily, if given access to an accurate picture of their marital estate, would be entitled to far more than he intended to give her. When Rachel read that number aloud, $2.3 million, Emily heard Fitch exhale sharply. She heard Richard say something very low, very quick in Fitch's direction. She heard Fitch say equally low, "Richard, stop talking." Judge Reynolds looked up from the documents in front of him. He looked at the forensic accountant's report. He looked at the transfer records. He looked at Richard Caldwell with an expression that had moved well past judicial neutrality into something that was specifically and measurably not neutrality. "Counselor," he said to Rachel, "are you asserting that the full scope of concealed marital assets may be significantly larger than what has been documented here?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rachel said. "What we have documented represents what a 6-week forensic review has been able to trace through accessible records. We believe the actual scope requires a full forensic audit, with court-ordered access to all associated accounts and entities, including offshore structures." "Offshore," Judge Reynolds repeated. "Yes, Your Honor. The Cayman Islands entity identified in Mr. Harper's report appears to be the terminal destination for a significant portion of the transfers that we have not yet been able to fully trace." The judge made a note. It was a long note. He wrote for nearly 30 seconds without speaking, and the courtroom sat in the specific quiet of people watching a decision being made that they cannot yet see but can feel approaching. Fitch stood. "Your Honor, the defense disputes the characterization of these entities as vehicles for concealment. Many of these structures are standard in commercial real estate development and—" "Mr. Fitch." Judge Reynolds did not look up from his note. I have been presiding over family law proceedings for 16 years. I have seen standard commercial structures. What I am looking at is not standard." He finished his note. He set down his pen. He looked at Fitch directly. "Does your client wish to amend his testimony regarding the full scope of his asset holdings?" Fitch turned to Richard. What happened next was something Emily would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic. It was quiet. Richard Caldwell, a man who had spent his entire adult life performing confidence, sat in a courtroom chair and did nothing. He did not lean forward, he did not speak, he did not make a decision. He simply sat there while the empire he had built absorbed the reality of what was happening to it, and for perhaps 15 seconds he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had run out of moves. Then he said to Fitch in a voice low enough that only Fitch and the closest court officer could hear it clearly, "Tell him I need time." Fitch straightened. "Your Honor, the defense requests a recess to consult with our client regarding—" "15 minutes, Judge Reynolds said. Not a continuance. 15 minutes. The gavel came down. Emily turned to Rachel. $2.3 million. "Closer to 2.4 once we finish the full trace," Rachel said, already making notes. "He has been moving money for 22 months. The Cayman entity alone may hold between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on what the full audit shows." Emily stared at her. "He told me we had a good year, but not a great year last year. He said the market was soft." "The market was not soft," Rachel said. "He told me we needed to cut our personal spending." "You did not need to cut your personal spending." Emily sat with that for a moment. The specific absurdity of it. The intimate cruelty of sitting across a dinner table from a man who was hiding millions of dollars in offshore accounts and listening to him explain with the reasonable tone she had trusted for nearly 2 decades that they needed to be more careful with money. "Rachel," she said, "how long?" Rachel looked at her. "How long has he been planning this?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Based on when the first entity was created and the pattern of transfers, we believe he began planning the financial separation approximately 26 months ago." 26 months. More than 2 years before Emily found the text messages. Before the confrontation in the kitchen. Before the night she sat in the parking garage, unable to go upstairs. He had begun building his exit before she had any idea the marriage was in crisis. Emily looked at the defense table where Richard and Fitch were in urgent conference. She looked at the back of Richard's head. She thought about 26 months of dinners and weekends and conversations about the future, 26 months of driving together to charity events and standing together at cocktail parties, while he shook hands with people who respected him, and she stood slightly to his left, being the wife he was already planning to leave. "He knew before I did," she said. "Yes," Rachel said. "He looked me in the face every day for over 2 years while he was building this." "Yes." Emily nodded once slowly, the way you nod when you are not agreeing with something but simply accepting that it is true. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She turned back to face the front of the courtroom. Across the room, Samantha Pierce sat in the gallery with her new attorney and said nothing. The absence of the necklace at her throat was visible in the way she sat, slightly collapsed inward, like something that had been providing structural support had been removed. Her attorney was speaking quietly to her, and Samantha was listening with the expression of a person receiving information that is both necessary and unwelcome. Daniel Harper was still in the witness area speaking with Rachel's paralegal. He caught Emily's eye briefly, a professional acknowledgement, nothing more. Emily thought about what it had taken to get him there. 9 weeks of contact with Samantha, 6 meetings, all those careful recorded conversations, all that patient accumulation of truth that Samantha had offered freely because she had believed she was talking to someone who admired her. She had been so certain she was winning. That Emily thought was the thing that ran through all of it like a thread. Richard's certainty, Samantha's certainty, the absolute unquestioned confidence of people who believe they have correctly assessed every person around them and found them manageable. Richard had assessed Emily as financially dependent and emotionally too attached to fight effectively. Samantha had assessed Daniel Harper as a wealthy, available man who found her fascinating. They had both been so sure. The gavel came down again. Court resumed. Fitch stood immediately. "Your Honor, the defense has consulted with our client, and Mr. Caldwell would like to address the court directly." Judge Reynolds looked at Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, you are still under oath. Whatever you say in this courtroom is part of the record. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Your Honor." Richard stood. He had composed himself during the recess. The gray had not left his face entirely, but the paralysis had. He had found something to hold on to, some version of the story that he believed could still serve him. Emily recognized it, the slight squaring of his shoulders, the recalibration of his expression into something that aimed at sincerity. She had watched him do it in business meetings for years. He said, "I want to acknowledge that some of the financial structures that have been discussed today were not fully disclosed in my initial asset disclosure. That was wrong, and I take responsibility for it." Rachel was already writing. "However," Richard continued, and Emily almost smiled at the word, "however, the inevitable, however, I want the court to understand that these structures were created for legitimate business purposes, and the insurance matter it was a mistake in judgment. I should not have handled the proceeds the way I did. I understand that now." "A mistake in judgment," Judge Reynolds said. "Yes, Your Honor. You filed an insurance claim for jewelry you had arranged to be removed from your home," the judge said, his voice carrying the particular quality of a person reciting facts back to someone who has tried to soften them. "You collected $342,000. You transferred those funds through a corporate entity you controlled, and you gave the physical items that were reported stolen to your girlfriend. It was more complicated than Mr. Caldwell." The judge's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I am not asking you to characterize it. I am asking you to tell me whether those events occurred." A long silence. "Yes," Richard said. "In a general sense, yes." "In a general sense." Judge Reynolds looked at him steadily. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell." Richard sat. Rachel stood. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Caldwell's partial acknowledgement, the plaintiff renews her request for an immediate freeze on all identified assets and entities, a court-ordered forensic audit of all financial holdings, and an amended asset disclosure under oath within 72 hours. All three requests are granted," Judge Reynolds said. He was writing again. "I am also issuing a formal referral to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential charges, including insurance fraud, perjury, and concealment of marital assets. Mr. Caldwell, your passport will be surrendered to the court by end of business today." Fitch half rose. "Your Honor, that is a significant—" "It is a proportionate response to what this court has heard today," Judge Reynolds said. "If your client has concerns, he is welcome to address them through proper legal channels. His passport will be surrendered by 5 o'clock this afternoon. That is not a request." Fitch sat down for the third time. This time he did not look at Richard. Emily watched the gavel come down and thought, there it is. There is the moment the empire stops being Richard's empire and starts being a crime scene. She thought she would feel more than she did. What she felt was something quiet and specific and difficult to name. Not satisfaction, something more like the feeling of setting down a weight you have been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy. Rachel leaned toward her and said very quietly, "We are not done. The settlement negotiation now happens from a completely different position. He has nothing left to negotiate with. Everything he tried to protect is now subject to court oversight." "What does that mean for me?" Emily asked. "It means," Rachel said, "that you are going to receive what you are actually entitled to, not what he was willing to offer. What the law says is yours." Emily nodded. Across the room something was happening at Samantha's row in the gallery. Samantha's attorney had stood and was speaking to the court officer nearest the gallery. The court officer was listening, nodding. Then the court officer walked toward the bench and spoke quietly to the clerk, who in turn passed a note to Judge Reynolds. Judge Reynolds read the note. He looked at Samantha Pierce. "Ms. Pierce," he said, "I understand your attorney has indicated that you wish to address the court." Samantha's attorney stood. She was a woman in her mid-40s, composed and efficient, who had clearly just been hired 30 minutes ago and was doing her best with the situation. "Your Honor, my client wishes to cooperate fully with the court's inquiry. She has information regarding the events described in testimony today relevant to the court's understanding of the full situation." The courtroom, which had been vibrating at a low frequency of tension all morning, went very quiet. Rachel looked at Emily. Emily looked back at her. "Your Honor," Rachel said carefully, "the plaintiff has no objection to the court hearing from Ms. Pierce, provided that anything she says is properly documented for the record." "Noted," the judge said. He looked at Samantha. "Ms. Pierce, you are not a party to this proceeding. You are not compelled to speak. If you choose to speak, you should understand that what you say may be used in subsequent proceedings, civil or criminal. Has your attorney advised you of this? Yes, Samantha's attorney said. Miss Pierce, do you understand that? Samantha looked at the judge. She looked the way Emily had imagined she might look if you stripped away everything she used as armor, the confidence, the designer clothes, the calculated ease. She looked young, not 29 years old young, but genuinely young in the way of someone who has gotten themselves into something much larger and darker than they understood, and is only now seeing the full shape of it. Yes, Samantha said, I understand. Then you may speak. Samantha's attorney put a hand briefly on her arm. Samantha stood. She did not look at Richard. That was the first thing Emily noticed. She stood up, and she did not look at Richard at all. I want to say, Samantha began, and her voice was careful in the way of someone reading from an internal script they prepared during the recess, that I did not understand the full situation when I accepted the jewelry. Richard told me that the necklace and the other pieces were his to give. He told me that Emily had agreed to certain arrangements as part of the separation. He said the insurance had handled everything. She paused. I did not ask enough questions. I know that. But I want to be clear that I was not the one who planned the burglary or the insurance claim. That decision was his. The room absorbed this. Richard had gone absolutely rigid at the defense table. He planned it, Samantha said. Her voice was steadier now. He told me about it afterward. He said it was handled and not to worry about it. I should have... She stopped. I should have asked more. I know that. Emily looked at Richard. Richard was looking at the table. His jaw was working. A small, tight movement, the physical expression of something that wanted to come out and was being forcibly prevented. Fitch put his hand on Richard's arm. Richard shook it off. Fitch put it back more firmly. Emily watched the two of them in profile and thought about the moment in their kitchen the night it all came apart, when Richard had said, I think we should talk to lawyers, in that calm, managerial tone. She thought about how she had cried in the parking garage while Richard had presumably gone upstairs and gone to sleep. She thought about 26 months of dinners and events and conversations about nothing while he moved money and made plans and looked at her across the table with the practiced warmth of a man executing a strategy. She did not hate him. That surprised her. She was not sure she had ever hated him exactly. What she felt was something cleaner and in some ways more devastating than hatred. She felt the specific sadness of seeing someone you loved clearly for the first time, not the person you believed they were, not the version of them that existed in 18 years of hope and investment and careful self-deception, the actual person, the one who had been there all along. I was smaller than she had thought, not physically, in every way that mattered. Judge Reynolds said, Ms. Pierce, the court appreciates your statement. I would advise you to continue working with your attorney and to make yourself available to investigators if this matter proceeds to criminal review, as the court anticipates it will. I will, Samantha said. She sat down. Richard turned finally and looked at her. The look lasted a fraction of a second, but Emily, watching from across the room, read everything in it. Not anger, not betrayal. Something more primitive than either the look of a man who has just understood that the last wall he had is gone, that there is no version of the day he can construct anymore, that every door has been closed from the outside. Samantha did not look back at him. She was looking at her hands folded in her lap, and she was very still. Rachel was writing rapidly, filling half a page with notes. She tore the top sheet off her legal pad and passed it to her paralegal with a quiet instruction. The paralegal left the courtroom. Rachel turned to Emily and said very low, She just gave us everything we need to close the criminal referral. Richard cannot argue that he was unaware of the legal issues because Samantha just testified that he told her he had arranged the insurance claim deliberately. She threw him under the bus, Emily said. She told the truth, Rachel said. They are the same thing in this case. Emily considered that for a moment. She thought about the two of them, Richard and Samantha, and the architecture of what they had built together. The affair, the plan, the necklace worn into a courtroom as a declaration of victory. She thought about what it must have looked like from inside that arrangement, how solid it must have seemed, how complete. Two people who believed they had outmaneuvered everyone who could hurt them. She was going to leave him anyway, Emily said quietly. Wasn't she? Rachel looked at her. Daniel told you, Emily said. In those 9 weeks of contact, she was already thinking about her next move. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she asked Daniel several times about investment structures, how a person protects assets that were received as gifts, how quickly those assets could be liquidated if needed. Emily exhaled slowly. She wasn't with him because she loved him. No. And he wasn't with her because he loved her either. Not really. Emily looked across the room. He was with her because she made him feel like the man he wanted to be, young enough to start over, clever enough to get away with it. Emily. I'm not saying it to be sympathetic to him, Emily said. I'm saying it because I spent a year thinking I lost him to something real, to a real love, to something worth breaking 18 years for. She paused. He didn't even do that. He blew up our marriage for a transaction. Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Are you all right? I will be, Emily said. And she meant it. Not as a performance of strength, not as the thing you say in a courtroom because you want to appear composed. She meant it the way you mean things when they have been tested, when the testing is not theoretical, not prospective, but already mostly behind you, and you are standing in the wreckage of everything you thought your life was going to be and discovering that you are still standing. Judge Reynolds calls the room back to attention. Given the testimony and evidence presented today, this court is ordering the following. 1. All assets and entities identified in the forensic report submitted by the plaintiff are frozen pending full audit. 2. Mr. Caldwell will submit a complete and fully verified asset disclosure within 72 hours, subject to contempt proceedings if found to be incomplete. 3. The matter is referred to the Suffolk County District Attorney with a recommendation for investigation of insurance fraud, perjury in family court proceedings and criminal concealment of marital assets. 4. The current divorce settlement proposal submitted by the defense is rejected in its entirety, and the parties will return to settlement negotiations on the basis of the actual marital estate as determined by forensic audit. He paused. He looked at both tables. This court will not be scheduling further hearings until the audit is complete. I expect full cooperation from both parties. Any indication of obstruction or additional concealment will result in sanctions and a contempt finding. He looked at Richard specifically. Mr. Caldwell, I would like to be very clear. You have testified falsely in my courtroom today. You have presented documents that misrepresent your financial position. You have used criminal conduct to attempt to disadvantage your spouse in a legal proceeding. This court has seen what you are capable of. I will be watching the remaining stages of this case with that knowledge. Richard said nothing. Your passport, the judge said. Today, by 5 o'clock. The gavel came down. Emily sat in her chair while the courtroom began the particular organized movement of a session-ending papers being gathered, conversations resuming the bailiff, moving through the gallery, asking people to make their way out. She sat, and she felt the morning settling around her like something enormous, and finished, like the last note of a piece of music that has been building toward resolution for a very long time. Rachel was already on her phone speaking quietly and rapidly to someone at her office. Daniel Harper paused beside Emily's table on his way out. He was carrying his leather folder and his evidence box, and he stopped and looked at her and said simply, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm glad today went the way it did. Emily looked up at him. How much of it did you know before you walked in today? He considered the question seriously. All of the financial part, most of the rest. He paused. I didn't know she was going to wear the necklace. That was her decision, and it changed the morning significantly. It changed everything, Emily said. Daniel nodded once. It usually does, he said. The one thing they can't help doing, the one piece of evidence they carry right to you. He moved toward the door. Take care of yourself. He walked out. Emily sat alone at the plaintiff's table for a moment after everyone else had started moving. The courtroom was nearly empty now. The evidence bag containing her grandmother's necklace was still on the clerk's table, tagged and documented, waiting for the formal processing that would eventually return it to her. She looked at it. 11 sapphires, white gold, the repaired clasp that her grandmother had fixed twice in 2 different decades, because some things are worth the effort of repair. Emily stood up. She picked up her bag. She straightened her navy dress. She walked toward the door of courtroom 7 with the steady, unremarkable step of a woman who has somewhere to be. Rachel fell in beside her at the door. We have a lot of work ahead of us. The audit will take weeks. The criminal referral will move on its own timeline. I know, Emily said. But today was enough, Emily said. They walked out into the corridor together, and the courthouse moved around them with its ordinary noise and motion, and Emily Whitmore walked through it thinking of nothing in particular, except that the ground under her feet was solid, and that this specific, simple, unshakable fact was everything. The 48 hours after the hearing were the quietest Emily had experienced in months. Not peaceful quiet, the quiet of aftermath, the quiet of a storm that has passed through and left everything rearranged, and you are standing in the middle of it, trying to understand what belongs where now, what is salvageable, and what is simply gone. She stayed at her sister Carolyn's apartment in Cambridge. She had been sleeping there for 3 weeks already, ever since Rachel had advised her to leave the marital home before the hearing to prevent any last-minute complications with the property. Carolyn had made up the guest room with clean sheets and left a lamp on the way. She had been doing since Emily was 7 years old and afraid of the dark, and Emily had lain awake both nights after the hearing, staring at the ceiling and listening to the city outside the window and trying to process what had happened. She had won. That was the simple version of what had happened, the version that fit in a sentence, the version that other people kept saying to her when they called her sister, her friends from before the marriage, who had slowly reappeared over the past months, her college roommate who lived in Chicago and had texted immediately after Carolyn told her the news. They all said some version of it. You won. You did it. He got what he deserved. Emily did not know how to explain that winning a court case and recovering your sense of yourself were not the same process and did not happen on the same timeline. She was glad the evidence had held. She was glad Rachel had been thorough. She was glad that the financial records had been as clear as they were, and that Daniel Harper had been as skilled as he was, and that Samantha Pierce had walked into that courtroom wearing the one piece of evidence that turned a complicated financial case into something a judge could see with his own eyes. She was glad about all of it. And she was also at 2 a.m. on the second night sitting in Carolyn's kitchen with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, something she could not quite call glad about anything. Carolyn found her there at 2:15. She came into the kitchen in her robe, took one look at Emily, and sat down across from her without saying anything. She had always been good at that, at understanding when Emily needed presence rather than words. They sat together in the kitchen for a while, and finally Carolyn said, "Tell me what's actually going on in your head." "I keep thinking about the dinner parties," Emily said. Carolyn waited. "I hosted 46 dinner parties in 18 years, Emily said. "I counted. I went through my planner. 46 formal dinner parties for his clients, his investors, his business partners. I planned every single menu. I managed every seating arrangement. I knew who was allergic to shellfish and who was recently divorced, and who needed to be kept away from which competitor's representative and why." She looked at her tea. "He was moving money into offshore accounts for 26 months. He was planning to leave me and take everything. And I was planning seating charts. Emily, I'm not saying it for sympathy. I'm saying it because I cannot stop thinking about it, about how present I was and how absent he was, about how I was fully inside that marriage, completely all the way in, and he had been standing with one foot out the door for over 2 years. She set down her cup. How do you grieve something like that? It wasn't a marriage that failed. It was a marriage that was already being dismantled while I was still living inside it. Carolyn reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You grieve it the same way you grieve anything real. You let yourself feel it." "I'm afraid if I start, I won't stop." "You'll stop," Carolyn said. "You always stop. You're the strongest person I know, and I don't mean that in the way people say it to make you feel better. I mean it as a fact. I have watched you your whole life. You stop." Emily looked at her sister. "I was planning it for 26 months, she said again. "I know. Before I knew anything was wrong. Before I had any idea. I know." What does that do to a person's ability to trust their own perception of things? Carolyn, I was there. I was paying attention. I thought I knew him. Carolyn squeezed her hand. You knew who he was willing to show you, and you trusted that the way any reasonable person in a marriage trusts what they're shown. That is not a failure of your perception. That is a failure of his character. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Rachel called today." Carolyn's expression shifted. "And the forensic audit found more. The Cayman entity is holding $1.1 million. There are 2 additional LLCs in Nevada that hadn't been identified in the initial report. She thinks the total hidden asset pool is closer to $3 million than 2.3. Carolyn stared at her. "He had $3 million hidden," Emily said, "while we were cutting our personal spending because the market was soft." "That man," Carolyn said, and the restraint required to keep her voice at the level she kept it was audible. "That absolute, Rachel thinks the final settlement could be significantly larger than we originally projected," Emily said. She said between the marital estate, the hidden assets, and the potential penalty structures the court may impose for deliberate concealment, she used the word substantial. What does substantial mean? She wouldn't give me a number yet, but she said comfortable. She said the word comfortable. Carolyn exhaled. Okay, that's something. It is, Emily agreed. And then she picked up her tea and drank it, and sat with her sister in the kitchen for another hour, not saying very much, just being in the same room, and that was exactly what she needed. The next morning, Rachel called again at 8:15. We have a development, she said, and her voice had the quality it got when something significant had happened. Not excited. Rachel was never excited, but precise in a specific way, each word chosen with extra care. Richard's attorney contacted me at 7 this morning. Emily was standing in Carolyn's kitchen, still in her pajamas, holding her phone. What did he say? Gerald Fitch has withdrawn from the case. Emily sat down on the nearest kitchen chair. He dropped Richard. He filed a withdrawal of representation last night, Rachel said. Richard Caldwell is currently without an attorney. Can he do that this close to? He cited irreconcilable differences with his client regarding the recommended legal strategy, Rachel said, which in plain language means Richard refused to follow Fitch's advice, and Fitch decided he would rather lose the client than his reputation. What advice did Richard refuse? We don't know for certain, but based on what happened in that courtroom yesterday, I would guess Fitch told him to cooperate fully with the audit, make a complete disclosure, and negotiate a settlement from a position of honesty, rather than continuing to contest the process. A pause. And Richard said no. Emily processed this. He still thinks he can control it. He still thinks there is a move, Rachel said. There isn't, but he believes there is, and that belief just cost him the only attorney who knew his case well enough to protect him from himself. What does this mean for the timeline? It means the 72-hour deadline for his amended asset disclosure is now in jeopardy because he will need time to retain new counsel. I am filing a motion today asking the court to hold the deadline firm regardless of his representation status. Judge Reynolds will not be sympathetic to delay tactics at this stage. Good. There is something else, Rachel said. Emily waited. The Suffolk County District Attorney's Office called our office yesterday evening, Rachel said. They have opened a formal investigation. They've requested copies of everything we submitted to the court. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. That's a criminal investigation, she said. Yes. Into Richard. Into Richard and potentially others. A deliberate pause. The DA's office specifically mentioned the insurance fraud component. That is a state crime. The concealment of marital assets has civil implications here, but the insurance fraud, filing a false claim, collecting fraudulent proceeds, that is a criminal matter entirely separate from the divorce proceeding. How serious. Insurance fraud in Massachusetts carries up to 5 years, Rachel said. On the high end with the dollar amounts involved, and the deliberate nature of the scheme, the coordination, the timing, the use of corporate entities to move the money, the DA will have arguments for significant charges. Emily sat in Carolyn's kitchen chair and looked at the wall. 5 years. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She did not feel satisfaction or vindication. She felt the specific heaviness of a situation that had grown beyond the boundaries of a divorce case and become something with its own momentum, its own weight, its own set of consequences that no one, not even her, fully controlled anymore. Rachel, she said, I didn't start this to send him to prison. I know, Rachel said. But you started it to recover what was taken from you and to have the truth on the record. The criminal process is a consequence of his choices, not yours. Is there anything I can do to... No, Rachel said, not unkindly. Once the DA opens an investigation, it proceeds on its own. Your cooperation may be requested as a witness, but you cannot stop it and you cannot direct it, nor should you try. Emily was quiet. This is not your fault, Rachel said. He made these decisions. He made them for 26 months. He made them when he staged the burglary, and when he filed the insurance claim, and when he gave that necklace to Samantha, and when he testified falsely in front of a federal judge. Every step of this is his. I know that intellectually. Let it be true emotionally too, Rachel said. That is the part that takes longer. But let it be true. Emily thanked her and hung up. She sat for a long moment, then called Carolyn's name, and Carolyn appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like she had been listening from the hallway, which she probably had. Fitch dropped him, Emily said, and the DA opened an investigation. Carolyn sat down. "Oh, Richard." It was such an Carolyn thing to say, not triumphant, not vindicated, just the sad recognition of a man who had walked himself into something irreversible. "I know," Emily said. They looked at each other. "It's going to be okay," Carolyn said. "Yes," Emily said. "It is." 3 days later, Richard Caldwell appeared in Judge Reynolds's courtroom with a new attorney, a solo practitioner named Howard Marsh, who had a modest practice in Back Bay and who looked to Emily's eye like a man who had taken a case he was already slightly afraid of. Marsh was competent enough. He spoke clearly, cited the relevant precedents, and managed to project a surface calm that the situation probably did not warrant. But he was working with material that had already been excavated, mapped, and documented, and whatever strategy he had arrived with Judge Reynolds had clearly run out of patience for strategies. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table beside Rachel and watched Howard Marsh attempt to negotiate the terms of the asset disclosure deadline. He said, "Your Honor, my client needs additional time to compile a complete accounting of all entities and holdings. Given the complexity of his business structure, Judge Reynolds said, is largely a product of deliberate obfuscation. The court's forensic accountant has already identified the primary entities. What is required is not discovery, Mr. Marsh. What is required is your client's honest cooperation with a process that is already well underway." He looked at Marsh steadily. "How much time is your client requesting?" 2 weeks, Your Honor." "You have 4 days," the judge said. "Full disclosure. Every entity, every account, every asset. If the forensic accountant finds after your client's disclosure that anything has been omitted, I will treat that omission as contempt. Is that understood?" Marsh turned to Richard. Richard was sitting very still beside him. He had aged, Emily thought, in the 3 days since the hearing. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movies where a character's face visibly shows the weight of events. More subtly than that. Something in the way he held himself. The particular quality of a man who has stopped performing confidence because there is no audience left worth performing for. He looked at the table in front of him. He said very quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." The gavel came down. Rachel made a note. Emily watched Marsh gather his papers and say something to Richard in a low voice. Richard listened without responding. Then, as the courtroom began to empty, something happened that Emily had not anticipated and would not forget. Richard looked at her. Not the brief, involuntary glance from the first hearing. This was deliberate. He turned in his chair at the defense table, and he looked directly at Emily across the 15 feet of courtroom floor between them, and for a moment he just looked. Emily looked back. She did not look away. She did not look at Rachel for guidance. She simply sat there and met his eyes and let the silence between them be exactly what it was, the entire weight of 18 years and everything that had been done to them and to her and to the truth that used to live at the center of their life together. Richard opened his mouth. He said, "I'm sorry, Emily." She heard it clearly. She was certain she heard it correctly. She did not respond. She did not look away. After a moment, Richard turned back to his table. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He put it on with the careful movements of a man who is trying to preserve the last shreds of dignity in a room that has seen everything. And he walked out. Rachel was watching her. "Are you all right?" "He apologized," Emily said. "I heard. I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Rachel said. "Not today." Emily nodded. She looked at the defense table empty now and at the door through which Richard had walked out, and she thought about what an apology from a man like Richard was worth in the context of 26 months of planning and calculated deception. She thought about the insurance claim and the hidden accounts and the necklace on Samantha's throat in the hallway and the 46 dinner parties. She thought about what it cost her to have heard those 2 words and felt nothing. Not relief. Not satisfaction, not even the complicated mixed feeling she had expected. Just a kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and discovered when it finally arrived that they no longer needed it. "Let's go," she said to Rachel. They walked out together. In the corridor, Rachel's paralegal was waiting with a folder of documents that needed Emily's signature authorizations related to the audit process releases, allowing the forensic accountant access to certain shared accounts. Emily stood at a small table near the courthouse entrance and worked through them page by page, initialing where Rachel indicated, signing where the paralegal pointed. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to formally authorize the dismantling of the financial structure Richard had spent 26 months constructing. While she signed, she thought about Samantha. She had not thought about Samantha as much as she had expected to after the hearing. Samantha had become almost peripheral in the days that followed, which surprised Emily when she noticed it. For months, Samantha had occupied an enormous space in Emily's mind, the face of the betrayal, the physical embodiment of everything that had been taken. But now, with the evidence on the record, and the investigation open, and the necklace sitting in an evidence bag waiting to be returned, Samantha felt less like a central figure and more like a supporting character who had overestimated her own importance to the story. She had said in the courtroom that she had not understood the full situation when she accepted the jewelry. Emily believed that was partially true and partially self-serving. The way most statements people make in their own defense are partially true and partially self-serving. What Samantha had understood and what she had chosen not to examine too carefully were probably not entirely the same thing. But that was Samantha's accounting to make with investigators, with whatever attorney she eventually retained with herself in the quiet of her own conscience. Emily was finished with carrying Samantha's story. She had enough of her own to carry. Rachel's paralegal collected the signed documents and left. Rachel put her hand briefly on Emily's shoulder and said, "The audit timeline is 4 to 6 weeks. After that, we schedule the settlement conference. By the time we get there, every number will be on the table and verified." She paused. "You are going to be fine, Emily. I want you to know that. Not fine eventually, fine in a real and specific way." "What does fine look like?" Emily asked. Rachel considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions that deserved it. "It looks like your own life," she said, "on your own terms, without anyone else deciding what it's worth." Emily walked out of the courthouse and into the September afternoon. She stood on the steps for a moment, not going anywhere, just standing. The city was doing what cities do, moving noisy, indifferent to the individual lives happening inside it. A cab passed. 2 women walked by talking quickly about something that had nothing to do with divorce or fraud or sapphire necklaces. A man in a delivery uniform was eating a sandwich on a bench across the street. Emily took a long breath of September air. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Carolyn," she answered. "I'm out." "How was it?" He apologized. A pause. "What did you say?" "Nothing." Another pause. "That's probably right," Carolyn said. "I think so." "Are you coming back here?" "In a little while," Emily said. "I think I'm going to walk for a bit." She put her phone in her bag and walked down the courthouse steps and turned left along the sidewalk and walked through the city in the September afternoon without any particular destination. She walked past coffee shops and office buildings and a small park where 2 children were arguing about something on a bench while their grandmother watched them with the patient expression of someone who has seen arguments resolve before and expects to see it again. She walked for a long time. She thought about Rachel's question, "What does fine look like?" And she turned it over in her mind, the way you turn an unfamiliar object in your hands, trying to understand its shape from every angle. She thought about her apartment. Not the marital home she and Rachel had already agreed she would not be returning to that house, that it would be part of the settlement sold and divided, but the apartment she had already begun looking at. A 2-bedroom in Beacon Hill on the 4th floor with windows that faced east. She had walked through it on a Thursday morning 3 weeks ago, alone with a real estate agent who did not know her or her history, and she had stood in the empty living room and thought, I could live here. Not as a consolation, not as a smaller version of something that had been taken, as a beginning. She thought about the network of people she had built over 18 years, the event planners, the charity directors, the real estate community, contacts, the philanthropic circles, and the career she had quietly begun, researching the events management consultancy that Rachel had specifically noted in her financial arguments, the documentation of Emily's professional-grade contributions to Richard's business that had been entered into the court record. All of that was hers, the skill, the relationships, the track record. Richard's name was not on any of it. It had never been on any of it. She had built it with her own competence and her own social intelligence and her own relentless attention, and it was waiting for her exactly where she had left it. She thought about the necklace. When the legal process completed and the evidence was formally returned to her, she was going to take it to the jeweler who had repaired the clasp decades ago, a small shop on Newberry Street that had been there for 40 years, run now by the original owner's son. She was going to have the clasp examined, the settings checked, the stones cleaned. She was going to wear it to the first event she organized on her own, the first dinner she hosted in her own space under her own name. She was going to wear it because it had survived harder things than this. Her grandmother had said so, and her grandmother Emily thought had been right about most things that mattered. She walked for 40 minutes. Then she stopped and hailed a cab and gave Carolyn's address and sat in the back seat as the city moved past the windows. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel DA's office confirmed they will seek charges. Expect formal announcement next week. You will likely be asked to give a statement as the named victim. I'll prepare you. You'll be fine. Emily read the message twice. Named victim. She thought about that phrase and what it meant and what it did not mean. A victim was someone who had been acted upon. A victim was someone at the receiving end of someone else's choices. That was all true. That was accurate. She had been acted upon. She had been lied to and deceived and had something irreplaceable taken from her and had been maneuvered and manipulated by the person who was supposed to be her partner. All of that was true, and it was not the whole truth, because she had also hired Rachel Morgan. She had also given Rachel the provenance documents for the jewelry 3 weeks before the hearing. She had also recognized the necklace in the courthouse hallway and stayed silent when every instinct told her to confront Samantha right there in front of everyone. She had also sat at that plaintiff's table for an entire morning and held herself together with a precision and a will that cost her enormously in ways that no one in that courtroom except possibly Rachel had understood. She had not been only acted upon, she had acted. The cab pulled up in front of Carolyn's building. Emily paid and got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going inside. Named victim. She typed back to Rachel, "I understand. I'll be ready." Then she put her phone in her bag and went inside to her sister. Upstairs, Carolyn had made dinner. Nothing elaborate pasta, a salad bread from the bakery around the corner. She had set the table properly with the good plates she used for occasions that deserved acknowledgement, and there was a bottle of wine open on the counter that was better than what they usually drank on a weeknight. Emily sat down. Carolyn poured the wine and sat across from her, and they looked at each other across the table the way they had looked at each other across tables their entire lives as children in their mother's kitchen, as young women in their first apartments as adults, navigating the ordinary and extraordinary terrain of being alive. And Carolyn raised her glass and said simply, "To you." Emily raised hers. "To what's next?" Emily said. They drank. Outside the city went on being itself. The investigation proceeded on its own timeline. The audit worked through its 47 pages of transfers and entities and numbered accounts. The legal machinery of consequences moved forward steady and inexorable toward whatever it was going to find. And inside Carolyn's apartment, Emily Whitmore ate dinner with her sister and talked about ordinary things and laughed twice at something Carolyn said about a colleague at her office and felt the specific, irreplaceable comfort of being known by someone who has known you your whole life. It was not the life she had planned. It was hers. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, that felt like exactly enough. The forensic audit took 5 weeks and 4 days. Rachel called Emily on a Tuesday morning in late October with the final number, and Emily was standing in the kitchen of her new apartment in Beacon Hill. She had signed the lease 11 days after the hearing, keys in hand the following Monday, and she was drinking her first cup of coffee of the day when her phone rang, and Rachel said without preamble, because Rachel never used preamble when the facts were sufficient on their own, the total confirmed marital estate, including all hidden entities and offshore holdings, is $4,830,000. Emily set down her coffee cup. "Say that again," she said. $4,830,000, Rachel repeated. The Cayman entity held more than we initially projected. The Nevada LLCs had additional holdings the initial report did not capture, and the forensic accountant identified 2 investment accounts that Richard had titled in a business name, but which contained funds that are unambiguously marital in origin. Emily stood very still in her kitchen. "He told me we were comfortable but not wealthy," she said. "He told me that every year, comfortable but not wealthy." "He was lying every year," Rachel said. $4.8 million. Nearly 4.9 once the interest accrual on the frozen accounts is calculated. Emily picked up her coffee cup again because she needed something to hold. "What does this mean for the settlement?" "It means," Rachel said, and Emily could hear in her voice the particular satisfaction of a person who has been doing meticulous work for months and is finally able to show what that work produced, "that your share of the marital estate under Massachusetts equitable distribution law, combined with the court's indicated penalty for deliberate concealment and the compensatory award for the stolen jewelry and fraudulent insurance claim, will be between $2.1 and $2.4 million, depending on how the judge structures the final order." Emily sat down on the nearest kitchen chair. $2.1 million. She had walked into this divorce believing Richard's version of their financial life. She had believed they had a good business and a comfortable home and a respectable net worth that she would receive a fair share of. She had not known about the offshore accounts, or the Delaware LLCs, or the Nevada investment holdings, or the 26 months of deliberate concealment. She had not known that the man who told her every year that they were comfortable but not wealthy was quietly building a hidden fortune while she organized his dinner parties and managed his reputation and made his professional life possible. She had not known any of it, and yet. Rachel continued, "I want to be clear about timing. Richard's new attorney Marsh has indicated that Richard is prepared to settle rather than continue to contest the proceedings. Given the DA investigation, Marsh has almost certainly advised him that cooperation in the civil matter will be viewed favorably by prosecutors, so I expect a settlement conference within the next 10 days. He wants this over," Emily said. "He needs this over," Rachel said. "Every day the civil case continues is another day the criminal investigation builds on the same evidence base. His only path to any kind of controlled outcome is to settle the divorce quickly and then present himself to the DA as cooperative. And Samantha," a brief pause. "The DA's office confirmed last week that Samantha Pierce has been offered a cooperation agreement. She is providing testimony and documentation regarding her conversations with Richard about the burglary and the insurance claim. In exchange, the charges against her will be reduced significantly." Emily absorbed this. "She's testifying against him." "Yes. The woman he left me for is going to help send him to prison." "That is the current trajectory, yes." Emily looked at the wall of her new kitchen. The wall was white and bare. She had not put anything on it yet. She had been living in this apartment for 11 days, and the walls were still entirely empty, which was either a problem to solve or a statement she had not yet consciously made. "Rachel," she said, "when this is over, when the settlement is signed and the criminal case is in the DA's hands and my name is off every document connected to Richard Caldwell, what do I do?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of not knowing, but the silence of choosing the right words. "You live your life," she said, "the one that was always yours. You just couldn't see it clearly from inside his." Emily said nothing. "I will call you when Marsh reaches out," Rachel said, "probably by Thursday." They hung up. Emily sat in her kitchen for a long time after that, with her cold coffee and the bare white walls and the morning light coming through the east-facing windows she had loved when she first walked through this apartment. She sat and she thought about $4.8 million hidden behind the face of a man she had trusted without reservation for nearly 2 decades. She thought about what that kind of concealment required, the daily maintenance of it, the constant calibration of what to say and not say, the management of her expectations and her access and her understanding of their shared financial life. She thought about how much energy that must have taken, and then she thought about her own energy, all of it. Everything she had poured into the marriage, into the house, into the events and the dinners and the relationships and the invisible operational infrastructure that had allowed Richard's life to run smoothly for 18 years. She thought about what she was going to do with that energy now that it had nowhere to go but forward. She picked up her phone and called a woman named Patricia Lowe. Patricia Lowe was 63 years old and ran the largest independent charitable events organization in Boston. Emily had known her for 14 years, had worked alongside her on 7 major fundraising events, and had once at a gala that Emily had personally organized, and Patricia had attended as a guest, overheard Patricia say to the woman beside her, "Whoever planned this evening is wasted in a supporting role." Emily had never forgotten it. She had filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not yet ready to use. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Emily, I've been hoping you'd call." Emily blinked. "You have? I heard about the hearing." Patricia said without embarrassment about the fact that she had heard. Boston's philanthropic community was not large. News moved through it the way news moves through any community of people who have known each other for years. I am sorry for what you went through, and I want to have lunch with you this week if you're available. Why? Emily asked. Because I am launching a new events division in January, Patricia said. A standalone consultancy separate from the main organization, and I have been trying to figure out for 6 months who I want to run it. And I think if you're interested, and if the timing works for you, the answer might be sitting in my phone waiting for me to call her. Emily sat very still. Patricia. I'm not offering charity, Patricia said, and her voice had the crisp, no-nonsense quality of a woman who has built something real and knows the difference between kindness and business. I have watched you work for 14 years. I know exactly what you can do. This is a professional conversation, not a sympathy call. Emily looked at her bare white wall. Yes, she said. I'm available. Name the day. They met on Thursday at a restaurant in the Back Bay that Patricia had been going to for 20 years. They sat for 3 hours. Patricia laid out her vision for the consultancy, an independent entity that would work with high-net-worth clients and nonprofit organizations across New England planning events at a level of customization and quality that the larger event management firms could not offer. She needed someone who understood both worlds, the private sector clients with money and standards, and the nonprofit sector with its specific culture and its specific constraints. Emily listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then she asked 14 questions, in order each one following naturally from the answer to the last. And by the time she got to the 14th question, Patricia was leaning forward slightly in her chair with the expression of someone confirming what they already believed to be true. You've been thinking about this for a while, Patricia said. It was not a question. I've been thinking about it for about 14 years, Emily said. I just didn't have the language for it until recently. Patricia smiled. When can you start? Give me until after the settlement is finalized, Emily said. I want to begin this without any unfinished business behind me. Done, Patricia said. She raised her water glass. To the consultancy. Emily raised hers. To what's next? It was the same toast she had made with Carolyn the night after the second hearing. She meant it the same way. More specifically now, but the same way. The settlement conference took place on a Thursday morning in the second week of November. Emily wore the same navy dress she had worn to the initial hearing. She had almost chosen something different. Some part of her felt that she should mark the occasion with something new, something that announced the person she was becoming, rather than the one who had sat at that plaintiff's table in September. But she put on the navy dress and looked at herself in the mirror and thought, no, this is the right choice. This is the dress she was wearing when she won. She would wear it when she finished winning, too. The conference was held not in the courtroom, but in a smaller room off the main corridor, a conference room with a long table and fluorescent lighting and a water pitcher in the center that nobody touched. Judge Reynolds was not presiding over the conference itself, but his standing orders governed every parameter of it, and the weight of his October rulings was present in the room as surely as if he had been sitting at the head of the table. Howard Marsh arrived with Richard. Emily had not been in the same room as Richard since the second hearing 3 weeks earlier. She watched him walk in and take his seat across the table, and she felt nothing dramatic. Not rage, not grief, not the complicated mixture of love and loss that had characterized the first months after she found the text messages. She felt the specific neutrality of a person looking at someone they once knew very well and finding that the knowing has become historical rather than present. He belonged to her past, completely and specifically and without remainder. He looked at her once when he sat down. She looked back once. Then both of them looked at their respective attorneys and the conference began. Marsh opened by presenting a settlement proposal. It was compared to what Richard had tried to negotiate 4 months earlier, a different document in almost every respect. The number had changed. The terms had changed. The characterization of Emily's contribution to the marital estate had changed completely. There was no longer any language about emotional instability or financial naivety or disproportionate claims. There was a number, and the number was a reflection of the actual marital estate as documented by the forensic audit, and Emily's share of it was substantial. Rachel reviewed it in silence for 4 minutes. Then she made 7 modifications, each one precise and non-negotiable. Marsh reviewed Rachel's modifications. He conferred with Richard in a whisper that lasted approximately 90 seconds. Then he looked up and said, "We accept modifications 1 through 5. We need to discuss 6 and 7. Modification 6 was the compensatory award for the stolen jewelry and the fraudulent insurance claim. Rachel was asking for the full documented value plus a penalty multiplier that the court had indicated it would support." Marsh wanted to reduce the multiplier. Rachel said, "The penalty multiplier is consistent with Judge Reynolds's October ruling, which characterized the concealment as deliberate and sustained. If your client wants to contest the multiplier, we can return to the courtroom and ask the judge to set it. I am confident of how that conversation will go." Marsh looked at Richard. Richard said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the table, the same table looking he had done in the courtroom, but it felt different now. Not the paralysis of a man running out of moves, but the more mundane exhaustion of a man who has finally run out of the will to fight something he cannot win. "Fine," Richard said quietly. "The multiplier stands." Marsh nodded. "Modification 6 is accepted." 7, Rachel said. Modification 7 was a clause that Emily had asked Rachel to include and that Rachel had initially questioned the necessity of. It was not about money. It was about the provenance documentation for the jewelry collection, a formal legal acknowledgement written into the settlement agreement that the items had been stolen from Emily Whitmore's possession and that the insurance claim filed in connection with those items had been fraudulent. Richard's signature on the agreement would constitute a formal, documented, legally binding admission of those facts. Marsh had gone very still when he read it. "This clause," Marsh said carefully, "creates significant exposure for my client in the criminal proceeding." "Yes," Rachel said, "it does. You understand that we cannot agree to language that—" "Your client has already admitted the essential facts in open court," Rachel said. "Judge Reynolds's rulings reference those admissions explicitly. This clause simply ensures that the settlement agreement is consistent with the record. If your client's concern is criminal exposure, I would suggest that concern is better addressed with the DA's office than by asking us to omit facts that are already in the public record." Marsh conferred with Richard again. This conference lasted longer, nearly 4 minutes. At one point, Richard's voice rose slightly, and Marsh put his hand on Richard's arm firmly, the same gesture Fitch had made in the courtroom, and Richard went quiet. Then Marsh said, "We'll accept modification 7. Emily did not react outwardly. Inwardly, she felt the specific click of something that has been waiting to lock into place finally doing so. Not triumph. Completion. The feeling of a sentence that has been waiting for its period. The agreement was reviewed in full. Every clause, every number, every term. It took 40 minutes. Rachel made 2 additional small adjustments that Marsh accepted without significant resistance. Then the document was printed and placed on the table between them. Rachel slid it across to Emily. Emily looked at it. It was 11 pages long. The number at the top of the financial summary page was $2.3 million, which was the agreed settlement figure after all adjustments. There was the clause about the jewelry. There was the clause about the marital home to be sold, proceeds divided according to the formula in the agreement. There was the clause about Richard's business interests and Emily's share of the established enterprise value. There was the clause about the hidden entities, each one named, each one addressed. And at the bottom of page 11 there was a signature line. Emily picked up the pen. She thought about her grandmother, who had crossed an ocean with a necklace and nothing else, and built a life on the other side. She thought about Carolyn, who had left a lamp on every night for months. She thought about Rachel, who had spent 14 weeks being absolutely certain when Emily could not be. She thought about Patricia Lowe and the consultancy and the bare white walls in the Beacon Hill apartment that she was going to fill with things she chose herself. She signed. The pen moved across the paper, and she signed her name, Emily Whitmore, not Emily Caldwell. She had returned to her own name 3 weeks earlier, and it had felt like putting on a coat she had left on a hook 19 years ago and finding that it still fit perfectly, and she set the pen down. Rachel signed as witness. Marsh signed. Richard picked up the pen. He held it for a moment. Emily watched him. She watched him look at the document at the signature line at the 11 pages of everything his empire had become. She watched him hold the pen with the stillness of a man at the very end of something with nothing ahead of him that he can see clearly yet. He signed. The room was quiet for a moment after all the signatures were in place. Marsh gathered the documents efficiently, the practiced motion of an attorney managing an ending. Rachel made notes on her legal pad. The water pitcher in the center of the table caught the fluorescent light the way it had been doing for the entire conference, indifferent to everything. Richard stood. He picked up his jacket. He said without looking at anyone in particular, "I hope you'll be all right, Emily." Emily looked at him. She thought about whether to say anything. She considered the various things she could say, the things she had rehearsed in her head at 2 a.m, the things she had thought of in the parking garage all those months ago, the things she had carried through depositions and hearings and forensic audits and conference rooms. She said, "I will be." Just that. 3 words. The same 3 words she had said to Rachel in the courtroom back in September, when the evidence was first coming into the light, and she did not yet know how far the light would reach. She meant them more completely now. Richard walked out. Marsh followed. The door closed. Rachel looked at Emily. "It's done." "Yes," Emily said. "How do you feel?" Emily considered the question honestly, the way she had learned over the past months to consider things honestly, rather than reaching automatically for the version of the answer that was easiest to offer. "Tired," she said, "and clear, mostly clear." "Clear is good," Rachel said. "Clear is very good." They walked out of the conference room together, and Emily stopped at the water fountain in the corridor and drank because she was thirsty. And that simple physical fact felt like the most ordinary and therefore the most significant thing she had done in months. She was thirsty. She drank water. She was standing in a courthouse corridor in November with a signed settlement agreement in her attorney's briefcase and her own name on the paperwork, and nowhere she needed to be until 2 o'clock when she had agreed to call Patricia Lowe and begin the preliminary conversations about the consultancy. She was free. Not the abstract philosophical version of free, the specific concrete version, free of the legal proceedings, free of the financial uncertainty, free of the daily maintenance of a life built around someone else's version of reality. Free in the way that you can only be free after something has been fully, legally, documentably resolved, when the last signature is on the last page and there is nothing left unfinished. Rachel walked her to the courthouse exit, and they stood on the steps for a moment in the November cold. "What happens now with the criminal case?" Emily asked. "It proceeds," Rachel said, "on its own timeline separate from you. You will give a victim statement when the DA requests it. That will be the last formal act required of you." She paused. "After that, it's theirs, not yours." "Good," Emily said. "I want it to be theirs." Rachel looked at her with the expression she had worn a few times over the past 5 months. Not professional assessment, but something more personal than that. The look of a woman who does difficult work in difficult circumstances and occasionally encounters a client whose response to those circumstances she finds genuinely worth respecting. "You did well," Rachel said. "Through all of it. I want you to know that." Emily looked at her. "You did most of the work." "I did my job," Rachel said. "You did something harder. You stayed in it. You stayed present and clear, and you didn't flinch when the numbers got bigger or the story got uglier. A lot of people would have settled much earlier just to make it stop. You didn't." Emily thought about that. "I almost did," she admitted. "There were nights when I thought about just taking whatever he offered and being done with it." "What stopped you?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking about my grandmother," she said, "about the necklace, about what she survived to get here, and what she built, and what she left to the people who came after her. And I kept thinking that if I let him take that, if I let the lie stand and walked away with less than the truth, then I was letting him take something that was never his to take." Rachel nodded slowly. "The necklace is being processed for return," she said. "The evidence team estimated another 2 to 3 weeks. I'll let you know the moment it's available." "I know what I'm going to do with it," Emily said. "What? Wear it," Emily said simply. "At the first event I run for Patricia's consultancy." Rachel smiled. It was a real smile, not the professional acknowledgement that was her default in a work context, but an actual smile, brief and genuine. "That's the right answer," she said. They said goodbye. Emily walked down the courthouse steps and turned left along the sidewalk the same direction she had walked the last time she left this building. November was different from September, colder, sharper, with the specific quality of New England autumn that strips everything back to its essential structure, bare branches and clear sky and air that means business. She pulled her coat closer and walked. She walked past the coffee shop where she had once stopped with Carolyn after a difficult deposition, and sat for an hour without being able to eat anything. She walked past the park where the grandmother had watched the two children argue. The bench was empty today. The children were somewhere else in school or at home, going about the ordinary business of their lives. Emily walked. She thought about this 12 weeks since the hearing. She thought about every day of it, the calls with Rachel, the audit updates, the settlement negotiations, the signing of her apartment lease, the lunch with Patricia, the boxes she had packed and moved and unpacked in her new space. She thought about the night she had finally started putting things on the bare white walls, photographs, a painting she had bought at a gallery show the previous spring, entirely on her own instinct, a framed print of a line from a poem she had loved since college. She had hung them herself with a small hammer and a level on a Saturday afternoon with music playing, and Carolyn sitting on the couch telling her everything was slightly crooked when it was not. She thought about the morning 2 weeks ago when she had woken up and lain in her own bed in her own apartment and realized before she was fully awake that she had not thought about Richard in 3 days, not suppressed the thought, not distracted herself from it, simply had not thought about him the way you stop thinking about a noise when it stops. He had stopped being a presence in her interior life. That she thought was the real ending, not the signature on the settlement agreement, not the forensic audit number, not even the moment in the courthouse hallway when she had seen the necklace and understood what it meant. The real ending was the morning she woke up and found that the space he had occupied in her mind had been quietly, organically replaced by everything else: the consultancy, the apartment, the calls with Carolyn, the meals she cooked for herself, the plans she was making that belonged entirely to her. She walked for 30 minutes. Then she stopped on a corner she recognized she had walked past it many times over the years, usually on her way to some event or meeting or function connected to Richard's professional life, and she stood for a moment and let herself be exactly where she was, in her own city, in her own coat, on her way to her own life. Her phone buzzed, a text from Carolyn. "How did it go?" Emily typed back. "Done. All of it. Done." 3 dots appeared immediately. "Then get over here. I have champagne." Emily almost typed back that it was 11:30 in the morning. Then she thought about it and typed instead, "On my way." She hailed a cab. In the back seat, as the city moved past the windows, she thought one more time about the necklace, about the 11 sapphires in their Art Deco setting, the white gold, the repaired clasp that had survived 2 repairs and 1 ocean crossing and 1 staged burglary and 1 morning in a courthouse hallway and 5 weeks in an evidence bag. She thought about what it meant that the thing they had used to wound her had become the thing that undid them. Samantha had walked into that courtroom wearing it as a trophy, and it had become the instrument of her own exposure. Richard had given it as a gift, expecting it to disappear into Samantha's private possession, and instead it had walked into the light. Truth did that sometimes. It waited in the dark for the moment when someone's arrogance became too large to contain, and then it walked into a courthouse hallway and introduced itself. Emily had spent months being afraid that the truth would not be enough, that Richard's money and Richard's attorneys and Richard's practiced confidence would outweigh it, that the system would look at a woman who had been a wife and a hostess and an organizational anchor for 18 years and decide that those contributions did not count, could not be measured, did not constitute a claim on the life she had built, alongside a man who was secretly building a different life without her. She had been wrong to be afraid. The truth had been enough. It had been more than enough. The cab pulled up to Carolyn's building. Emily paid. She got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November cold, her breath visible in the air, the city making its ordinary noise around her. She was 44 years old. She had $2.3 million coming to her under a signed settlement agreement. She had an apartment with east-facing windows and walls. She had hung herself. She had a job beginning in January that was the natural extension of everything she had spent 20 years developing. She had a sister who had left a lamp on every night for months and was standing right now in her kitchen with champagne open at 11:30 in the morning because her sister needed to celebrate something real. She had her grandmother's necklace coming back to her. She had her own name. She had everything that mattered. Emily Whitmore walked into her sister's building, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, knocked twice on the door she knew would open immediately, and stepped forward into the life that had been hers all along, waiting solid as ground for her to finally claim it. Some things survive harder things than you can imagine. Her grandmother had been right. She always had been.